A woman bought for $43 stands on an auction block in the Kansas dust, watching her father's shame become her inheritance. But when a silent rancher with hollow eyes claims her contract, three broken boys come running through the crowd, not to watch their father buy help, but to see if this stranger might finally be the one who stays. What begins as public humiliation becomes something far more dangerous: a family barely surviving, a ranch collapsing under debt and sabotage, and a woman who refuses to be owned by anyone. This is a story about the price of survival, the cost of grief, and what happens when desperation forces strangers to become something stronger than family. If you want to see where this story goes, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this journey travels. The sun hammered down on the wooden platform like it had a personal grudge against everything still standing in Harper's Bend, Kansas. Eliza Mercer tried not to look at the crowd. She tried not to see the faces of people who'd known her since she was 7 years old, people who used to nod politely at Sunday gatherings, and now stared at her like she was livestock being measured for worth. Her father stood 20 feet away with his hat in his hands, shoulders bent like a man who'd already died but hadn't had the decency to fall over yet. He wouldn't look at her. Hadn't looked at her since the sheriff knocked on their door 3 days ago with the paperwork that turned her into collateral. The auctioneer, a thin man with tobacco-stained teeth and a voice that carried like a preacher's, droned on about the terms. Settlement auction, debt repayment, 1-year contract for domestic labor. The words blurred together into something that sounded almost legal, almost respectable, but everyone standing in that town square knew what they were really watching. They were watching a man sell his daughter because he'd gambled away their farm on a cattle investment that never materialized. Eliza kept her chin up. She'd decided that much 3 days ago when her father told her what was going to happen. She wouldn't cry. She wouldn't beg. She wouldn't give this town the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. "Do I hear 25, Jet?" the auctioneer called out. Silence. Just the wind kicking up dust and the creak of the platform under her boots. 20? A man near the back coughed. Someone's horse stamped impatiently. Eliza felt the weight of every second stretching out like a humiliation she couldn't escape. 15 then. Come on, folks. Strong girl, good hands, literate, can cook and sew. This isn't charity. This is practical help at a fair price. Eliza wanted to laugh at that. Practical help. Like she was a plow or a milk cow. $43. The voice came from the left side of the crowd, low and rough, like it hadn't been used much lately and didn't particularly want to be used now. Eliza turned her head and saw him. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of something harder than the Kansas dirt. He wore a brown work coat that had seen better years and boots that were scuffed nearly white at the toes. But it was his eyes that stopped her cold. They were gray, flat, and so tired they looked like they'd given up on hope a long time ago and were just going through the motions of being alive. The auctioneer blinked. 43? Well now, that's more than fair. Anyone else? No one spoke. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, a few people murmuring to each other, but no one challenged the bid. Sold then. Gideon Hale takes the contract. Eliza's stomach dropped. She knew that name. Everyone in Harper's Bend knew that name. Gideon Hale owned a ranch 15 miles north of town, a place that used to be one of the biggest cattle operations in the county until his wife died 2 years ago and everything went to hell. People said he'd gone quiet after that, stopped coming to town except for supplies, kept his boys out at the ranch and didn't talk to anyone unless he had to. And now he'd just bought her like a sack of grain. The auctioneer gestured for her to step down. Eliza's legs felt unsteady, but she forced them to move. She climbed off the platform, her boots hitting the dirt with a soft thud, and walked toward Gideon Hale because she didn't have any other choice. He didn't smile, didn't nod. Just watched her approach with those empty gray eyes like he was already regretting the decision. Eliza stopped a few feet away and met his gaze head on. If this man thought he'd bought someone who'd flinch and scrape, he was about to learn otherwise. "I can work," she said quietly. "I can cook, clean, mend, manage a household. I won't steal, and I won't run, but I won't be treated like property either." Gideon stared at her for a long moment. Then he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Fair enough. That was it. No explanation. No speech. Just 2 words and a nod like they'd agreed on the price of hay. Eliza heard footsteps behind her, fast, small footsteps pounding across the dirt, and then a voice, high and breathless, shouted, "Pa! Pa! Did you really get one?" She turned just in time to see 3 boys running through the crowd like wild horses. The oldest looked about 12, tall and lanky with dark hair like his father's. The middle one was maybe 9, stockier, with a serious face and dirt smudged across his cheek. And the youngest, couldn't have been more than 5, was sprinting with everything he had, his little legs pumping furiously. They didn't stop when they reached Gideon. They crashed into him like a wave, grabbing his coat, his arms, talking over each other in a rush of words Eliza couldn't quite follow. Is she really staying? Does she know how to make bread? Can she read stories? Will she leave like the others? That last question cut through the noise and landed like a stone in Eliza's chest. The youngest boy, the one with the wild blonde hair and wide blue eyes, had turned to look at her with an expression so raw and hopeful it hurt to see. Gideon put a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Enough, get back to the wagon." The boys didn't move. They just stood there, staring at Eliza like she was the answer to a question they'd been asking for a long time. Eliza crouched down slowly, bringing herself to the youngest boy's eye level. "What's your name?" He didn't answer, just looked at her with those big eyes and gripped his father's coat tighter. The middle boy spoke instead. "That's Samuel. I'm Thomas. And that's Jacob." He pointed to the oldest. "Well," Eliza said, keeping her voice steady, "I'm Eliza. And I don't know if I can make bread the way you like it, but I'll try. I can read stories if you want. And I'm not planning on leaving." Samuel's grip on Gideon's coat loosened just a fraction. Jacob, the oldest, studied her with a look that was far too sharp for a 12-year-old. The last 3 women Pa hired left before a month was up. "I'm not the last 3 women," Eliza said. Jacob didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue either. Gideon cleared his throat. "Wagon's this way." He turned and started walking toward the edge of the square where a weathered buckboard sat waiting. The boys followed immediately, glancing back at Eliza like they were afraid she'd vanish if they took their eyes off her for too long. Eliza stood, brushed the dust off her skirt, and followed. She didn't look back at her father, didn't look at the crowd, didn't look at the auctioneer counting Gideon's money with quick, greedy fingers. She just walked. The ride out to the Hale Ranch took nearly 2 hours. Gideon didn't talk. The boys sat in the back of the wagon, whispering to each other and stealing glances at Eliza like she was some kind of exotic animal they weren't sure how to approach. Eliza sat on the bench next to Gideon and watched the landscape roll past. The drought had turned everything brown and brittle. The grass crunched under the wagon wheels, and the few trees they passed looked skeletal, their branches reaching toward the sky like they were begging for rain that wasn't coming. "How long's it been since it rained?" Eliza asked. 41 days, Gideon said without looking at her. "That's a long time." "Yep." "Cattle struggling?" "Yep." Eliza gave up on conversation after that. If the man wanted to drive in silence, fine. She'd learned a long time ago that talking for the sake of talking didn't do much good. When the ranch finally came into view, Eliza's first thought was that it looked like something out of a bad dream. The house was 2 stories, wood frame, with a sagging porch and shutters that hung crooked. The barn leaned slightly to the left like it was drunk. Fences crisscrossed the property in broken lines, some posts missing entirely, others held together with fraying rope. A chicken coop sat near the house, half the wire torn away, and a few scrawny chickens pecked at the dirt like they'd given up on finding anything worth eating. "Home," Gideon said flatly. Eliza didn't respond. She was too busy calculating how much work it would take to make this place functional again. The boys jumped down from the wagon before it even stopped. Samuel ran toward the house, Thomas headed for the barn, and Jacob lingered near the wagon, watching his father with that same sharp, worried look. Gideon climbed down and offered Eliza a hand. She took it, stepped onto the dirt, and immediately felt the ground shift slightly under her boots. The earth was so dry it felt hollow. "Kitchen's inside," Gideon said. "Bedroom upstairs on the left is yours. Boys sleep in the 2 rooms on the right. I'm down the hall." "What about food?" "There's some. Not much." "Supplies?" "We'll go to town next week." Eliza nodded. "I'll need a full inventory. What you have, what you don't, what needs fixing." Gideon looked at her like she'd just spoken a foreign language. "You don't have to..." I'm here to work, Eliza interrupted. I might as well know what I'm working with. For the first time since the auction, something that might have been respect flickered across Gideon's face. It didn't last long, but it was there. Jacob can show you around, he said, then turned and walked toward the barn without another word. Jacob, who'd been standing quietly nearby, straightened up. Come on, I'll show you the house first. Eliza followed him up the porch steps, which creaked ominously under her weight. The front door stuck when Jacob pushed it, and he had to shove it with his shoulder to get it open. The inside of the house was worse than the outside. Dishes were piled in the kitchen sink, some crusted with food so old Eliza couldn't tell what it had been. The floor was covered in a layer of dust and dirt that looked like it hadn't been swept in months. The furniture, what little there was, sat at odd angles, like someone had moved it once and never bothered to put it back. But it was the silence that struck Eliza the hardest. The house felt hollow, empty, like something vital had been ripped out of it and no one had figured out how to fill the space it left behind. Pa doesn't really clean much, Jacob said quietly. He tries, but he's usually out with the cattle. And we do what we can, but it's okay, Eliza said. I'll handle it. Jacob looked at her with those same sharp eyes. Why'd you really come here? Eliza considered lying, considered saying something polite and simple, but there was something about the way this boy was looking at her, like he'd already heard too many lies and wouldn't believe another one, that made her tell the truth. Because I didn't have a choice, she said. My father owed money he couldn't pay, and this was the way out. So here I am. Jacob nodded slowly. That's what I thought. Does that bother you? No. He paused. Most people lie about it. Say they're here because they want to help or because they care. But they don't. They just want the money, and then they leave. I'm not here for the money, Eliza said. I'm here because I have to be. But that doesn't mean I won't do the work. Jacob studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded again, this time with something that looked like approval. Your room's upstairs, I'll show you. He led her up a narrow staircase that groaned with every step. The upstairs hallway was dim and smelled faintly of old wood and dust. Jacob stopped at the first door on the left and pushed it open. The room was small and plain. A bed with a thin mattress, a dresser with 2 drawers, a single window that looked out over the front yard. But it was clean, or at least cleaner than the rest of the house. And the bed was made. I fixed it up yesterday, Jacob said, when Pa said he was going to the auction. Eliza turned to look at him. You did this? Figured you'd need somewhere to sleep. Thank you. Jacob shrugged like it didn't matter, but the way his shoulders relaxed told Eliza it did. You should rest, he said. Paul wants you to start tomorrow. I'll rest later, Eliza said. Right now I want to see the rest of the property. Jacob looked surprised. You don't have to eat. I know. Eliza set her small bag on the bed and turned back to him. But I want to understand what I'm dealing with, so show me. Jacob hesitated, then nodded. Okay, come on. They spent the next hour walking the property. Jacob showed her the barn, which was even worse inside than it looked from outside. Tools were scattered everywhere, hay bales rotting in the corner, stalls that hadn't been mucked out in weeks. The cattle pastures were in slightly better shape, but the fences were falling apart, posts leaning at dangerous angles, wire sagging so low a calf could step over it without trying. How many head do you have? Eliza asked. 43, Jacob said. Used to be over 100. What happened to the rest? Jacob's face went tight. Some died in the drought. Some got stolen. Some Pa had to sell just to keep us fed. Eliza filed that information away. Stolen cattle meant someone was taking advantage of the situation. And if someone was stealing from the Hales, they weren't going to stop just because a woman showed up. They walked back toward the house just as the sun started to sink toward the horizon. Thomas was sitting on the porch steps, whittling a piece of wood with a small knife. Samuel stood nearby, watching him with quiet intensity. You hungry? Eliza asked. Both boys looked up at her, surprised. We got some beans left, Thomas said, and cornbread from 2 days ago. That's not dinner, Eliza said. That's surviving. Show me what you have in the kitchen. Thomas and Samuel exchanged glances, then got up and led her inside. The pantry was nearly bare. A half-empty sack of flour, some dried beans, a tin of lard that looked like it had seen better days, and a few withered potatoes that were more sprout than potato. This is it? Eliza asked. Pa buys more when we go to town, Thomas said defensively. But that's not till next week. Eliza nodded. Okay, then we make do with what we have. She rolled up her sleeves, tied her hair back with a strip of cloth she found in a drawer, and got to work. It wasn't much of a meal. Beans boiled with the last of the salt pork, cornbread made from scratch because the old stuff was too hard to eat, and a weak pot of coffee. But it was hot, and it was real food. And when Eliza set it on the table, the boys stared at it like she'd just conjured a feast out of thin air. Go get your father, Eliza said. Jacob ran outside and came back a minute later with Gideon, who looked suspicious and tired in equal measure. Sit, Eliza said. Gideon hesitated, then pulled out a chair and sat. The boys did the same, and for the first time since Eliza had arrived, they all sat together at the table. No one spoke. They just ate. But the silence wasn't hostile or empty. It was the kind of silence that came from people who were too hungry and too tired to waste energy on words. When the meal was finished, Samuel looked up at Eliza with those big blue eyes and said, "That was good." Eliza smiled. "I'm glad." Thomas nudged Samuel. "Say, thank you." "Thank you," Samuel whispered. "You're welcome." Gideon stood, picked up his plate, and carried it to the sink. He didn't say anything, but he paused for just a moment and looked at Eliza with something that might have been gratitude. Then he walked outside and the door closed softly behind him. That night, after the boys had gone to bed and the house had finally gone quiet, Eliza sat alone in the kitchen with a single candle burning on the table. She stared at the flickering flame and thought about the day, about the auction, about her father's shame and the crowd's stares and the $43 that had bought her a year of her life. She thought about Gideon's tired eyes and Jacob's sharp gaze and Samuel's desperate hope. She thought about the broken fences and the stolen cattle and the ranch that was falling apart one piece at a time. And she made a decision. She wasn't here to survive. She was here to fix this. Because if she was going to spend a year of her life at the Hale Ranch, she wasn't going to waste it scraping by. She was going to make this place work again, whether Gideon Hale liked it or not. Eliza blew out the candle, stood, and walked upstairs to her small, plain room. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The first week at the Hale Ranch taught Eliza three things. Gideon Hale was drowning in grief, his boys were holding the family together with sheer stubbornness, and the ranch itself was one bad storm away from collapse. She started with the house because it was the easiest problem to solve. She spent 2 full days scrubbing every surface, washing dishes, sweeping floors, beating rugs, and airing out rooms that smelled like they'd been sealed shut for years. The boys watched her at first, suspicious and uncertain, but by the 3rd day, Thomas was helping her haul water, and Samuel was following her around like a silent shadow. Jacob kept his distance. He spent most of his time in the barn or out with the cattle, but Eliza caught him watching her more than once, like he was waiting for her to prove she wasn't any different from the others who'd left. Gideon barely spoke to her. He left before dawn, worked until dark, and came back to the house just long enough to eat whatever Eliza had cooked before disappearing again. He didn't thank her, didn't acknowledge the changes she was making. He just existed in his own world of exhaustion and silence. Eliza didn't push. She knew grief when she saw it, and Gideon Hale was carrying enough of it to sink a ship. By the end of the first week, the house was livable again. The kitchen smelled like bread instead of rot. The floors were clean, and the boys had stopped looking at her like she might vanish at any moment. But Eliza wasn't finished. On the 8th day, she woke before dawn, dressed, and walked outside to find Gideon saddling his horse near the barn. "I want to see the books," she said. Gideon looked up, startled. "What?" "The ranch books, finances, expenses, income. I want to see them." Gideon frowned. "Why?" "Because this place is falling apart and I want to know why." "You don't need to." "Yes, I do," Eliza interrupted. "You hired me to work. Let me work." Gideon stared at her for a long moment. Then he sighed, tied off the saddle, and walked toward the house. Eliza followed. He led her to a small office off the kitchen, a cramped room with a desk, a chair, and shelves lined with dusty ledgers. Gideon pulled one of the ledgers down and dropped it on the desk with a heavy thud. "There. That's the last 2 years." Eliza opened the ledger and started reading. It didn't take long to see the problem. The numbers were a mess. Income dropping steadily month after month. Expenses climbing, loans taken out and not paid back, cattle sold at prices far below market value. And then there were the notes scrawled in the margins, notes about fences cut, cattle missing, supplies stolen. "Someone's sabotaging you," Eliza said. Gideon didn't respond. "Gideon." He looked at her, his expression flat. "I know." "Then why aren't you doing anything about it?" "Because I can't prove it. And even if I could, who's going to listen? The law doesn't care about a rancher losing a few head of cattle. They've got bigger problems." "Who do you think it is?" Gideon hesitated. Then he said, "Silas Boone." Eliza knew that name too. Everyone did. Silas Boone was the biggest landowner in the county, a man with money, power, and a reputation for getting what he wanted, no matter who he had to step on to get it. "Why would Boone want your ranch?" Eliza asked. "Water," Gideon said. "There's a creek that runs through the north end of my property. It's the only reliable water source for miles. Boone's been buying up land around here for years, and mine's the last piece he doesn't own. If I go under, he'll buy it for pennies and control every drop of water in the county." Eliza closed the ledger. "So we don't let you go under?" Gideon laughed, a short, bitter sound. "It's not that simple." "It never is," Eliza said. "But that doesn't mean we give up." Gideon looked at her like she'd just said something insane. "You don't understand." "I understand plenty," Eliza said. "I understand that you've got 3 boys depending on you and a ranch that's worth saving. I understand that Silas Boone is a bastard who thinks he can take whatever he wants. And I understand that if you don't fight back, you'll lose everything." Gideon's jaw tightened. "Why do you care?" Eliza met his gaze. "Because I'm here and I don't do things halfway." For a long moment, Gideon just stared at her. Then he nodded slowly. "Okay." "Okay?" "Yeah, okay. You want to help? Then help. But don't say I didn't warn you when this goes bad." "Noted," Eliza said. She spent the rest of the day going through the ranch books, making notes, and calculating what it would take to stabilize the finances. By the time the sun set, she had a plan. It wasn't a good plan, but it was better than nothing. That night at dinner, she laid it out for Gideon. "We need to stop the bleeding first," she said. "That means fixing the fences so you're not losing cattle. It means finding out who's stealing from you and putting a stop to it. And it means selling your next herd at a fair price instead of whatever Boone's middlemen are offering." Gideon listened, his face unreadable. "We also need to cut expenses," Eliza continued. "I can stretch the food budget further than you've been doing. I can mend clothes instead of buying new ones. And I can handle the garden if we can get seeds." "There's no money for seeds," Gideon said. "Then we'll trade for them." "Trade what?" Eliza thought for a moment. "Your boys are good workers, Jacob especially. Offer his labor to the neighbors in exchange for what we need." Gideon frowned. "Jacob's got enough work here. And he'll have more if this place collapses," Eliza said. "Right now, we need supplies more than we need pride." Gideon didn't respond. He just stared at his plate, his jaw working like he was chewing on something bitter. Finally, he said, "Fine. We'll try it your way." Eliza nodded. "Good." Across the table, Jacob was watching her with that sharp, calculating look again. But this time, there was something else in his eyes, something that looked like hope. The next morning, Eliza and Jacob rode into town. Gideon had given them a list of neighbors to visit, people who might be willing to trade labor for supplies. It was a long shot, but Eliza figured it was worth trying. Their first stop was the Morrison Farm, a small property about 5 miles east of the Hale Ranch. Mrs. Morrison was a widow in her 60s who ran the place with the help of her 2 daughters. She opened the door with a suspicious look, but when Eliza explained what they needed, her expression softened. "You're the girl from the auction," Mrs. Morrison said. Eliza's stomach tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Morrison looked her up and down. Then she glanced at Jacob, who stood quietly beside Eliza, his hat in his hands. "Gideon Hale's boy?" "Yes, ma'am," Jacob said. Mrs. Morrison nodded slowly. "I heard what happened to your ma. Damn shame." Jacob didn't respond. He just stared at the ground. "What kind of work are you offering?" Mrs. Morrison asked. "Anything you need," Eliza said. "Jacob's good with horses, strong enough to haul, and he can mend fences." Mrs. Morrison considered that. "I've got a barn roof that needs patching. Been putting it off because I can't afford to hire anyone. If the boy can do that, I'll trade him seeds, some flour, and a laying hen. Eliza glanced at Jacob. He nodded. Deal, Eliza said. They shook on it, and Jacob spent the next 3 days at the Morrison farm, patching the roof while Eliza worked the Hale ranch. When he came back, he brought a sack of seeds, 2 sacks of flour, and a fat brown hen that immediately started bossing the other chickens around. Mrs. Morrison says the roof's the best work she's seen in years, Jacob said, trying not to look pleased. Good, Eliza said. That means we can do it again. Over the next 2 weeks, they repeated the process. Jacob worked at neighboring farms. Eliza stretched every resource they had, and slowly, painfully slowly, the ranch started to stabilize. The fences got mended, the garden got planted, the pantry started to fill. The boys stopped looking so hollow-eyed and hungry, but Eliza knew it wasn't enough. Because late at night, when she lay in her small room and listened to the wind rattle the windows, she could hear Gideon pacing downstairs. She could hear the weight of his grief pressing down on the floorboards. And she knew that no amount of mended fences or planted gardens would fix what was really broken at the Hale Ranch. That would take something else, something Eliza wasn't sure any of them had left. But she'd come this far. She wasn't about to stop now. The morning Thomas found the cattle missing, the sky was still dark, and the air smelled like dust and something worse, something burnt and deliberate. Eliza was in the kitchen kneading dough when Thomas came crashing through the door, his face pale and his breath coming in sharp gasps. They're gone, he said. 8 head, just gone. Eliza's hand stilled in the flour. Where's your father? North pasture. Jacob went to get him. Eliza wiped her hands on her apron and followed Thomas outside. The sun was just starting to break over the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard. She could see Gideon riding hard from the north, Jacob clinging to the saddle behind him, both of them moving like the devil himself was chasing them. Gideon pulled the horse to a stop so fast it reared slightly. He swung down, and his boots hit the ground with a force that sent dust flying. Fence was cut, he said, his voice flat and dangerous. Clean cut. Not torn, not broken. Cut. Boone, Eliza said. Has to be. Can you prove it? Gideon's jaw clenched so hard Eliza could see the muscle jumping under his skin. No. Then what are you going to do? I'm going to town, Gideon said. I'm going to talk to the sheriff. The sheriff won't do anything, Jacob said quietly from behind his father. He never does. Gideon spun around. You don't know that. Yes, I do, Jacob said. His voice was calm, steady, and far too old for a 12-year-old boy. The sheriff works for Boone. Everyone knows it. You go to him. You're wasting time. Then what do you suggest? Gideon snapped. Jacob looked at his father with those sharp, calculating eyes. I suggest we stop waiting for help that's not coming and figure out how to protect what we have left. The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. Gideon stared at his son like he didn't recognize him, like Jacob had just said something unforgivable. Then Gideon turned, mounted his horse, and rode toward town without another word. Eliza watched him go, then turned to Jacob. You're right, you know. Jacob looked at her, surprised. About what? About the sheriff. About Boone. About all of it. Pa doesn't want to hear it. Your father's drowning, Eliza said, and drowning men don't always make good decisions. Jacob's expression flickered with something Eliza couldn't quite name. Pain, maybe. Or anger. Or both. So what do we do? Thomas asked, his voice small. Eliza looked at the 2 boys standing in front of her, one too young to be this scared, the other too young to carry this much weight, and made a decision. We fix the fence, she said, and then we figure out how to stop this from happening again. They spent the rest of the morning repairing the cut section of fence. It was hard, back-breaking work, and Eliza's hands were raw and bleeding by the time they finished. But the fence held, and that was something. When they got back to the house, Samuel was sitting on the porch steps, his knees pulled up to his chest, watching the road like he was waiting for something that wasn't coming. Pa's not back yet, he said without looking at them. He will be, Eliza said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. She made lunch, cornbread and beans again, because that was all they had. And the 3 boys ate in silence. Samuel barely touched his food. He just sat there, pushing the beans around his plate with a fork, his face pale and drawn. You need to eat, Eliza said gently. Samuel didn't respond. Samuel? What if Pa doesn't come back? Samuel's voice was so quiet Eliza almost didn't hear it. He'll come back, Jacob said firmly. You don't know that. Yes, I do. No, you don't. Samuel's voice cracked. Ma didn't come back. The women didn't come back. Why would Pa? The silence that followed was suffocating. Thomas stared at his plate. Jacob's jaw clenched, and Eliza felt something twist painfully in her chest. She reached across the table and put her hand over Samuel's. His fingers were small and cold. Your father will come back, she said, because he loves you, and because this is his home, and because men like your father don't run when things get hard. They dig in and they fight. Samuel looked up at her with those big blue eyes, so full of fear and hope it hurt to see. You promise? Eliza wanted to promise. She wanted to tell this little boy that everything would be okay, that his father would always come home, that the world wasn't as cruel and unpredictable as it seemed. But she'd learned a long time ago that promises like that were lies dressed up in kindness. I can't promise that, she said. But I can promise that I'm not going anywhere, and I'll do everything I can to make sure you're okay. Samuel's lower lip trembled. Then he nodded, just once, and went back to pushing his beans around his plate. Gideon came back just before sunset. He looked worse than when he'd left, his face drawn, his shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow. What did the sheriff say? Eliza asked. Gideon dismounted slowly, like every movement hurt. He said there's no evidence. He said cattle go missing all the time. He said unless I can prove someone cut that fence, there's nothing he can do. So he did nothing. He did nothing. Eliza nodded. She'd expected as much, but hearing it still made her angry. What now? She asked. Gideon looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something other than grief in his eyes. She saw rage, cold, controlled, and deeply buried, but there. Now we make sure it doesn't happen again, he said. That night, after the boys had gone to bed, Gideon and Eliza sat at the kitchen table with the ranch book spread out between them. The single candle on the table flickered, casting shadows across the numbers Eliza had been tracking for weeks. We can't afford to lose any more cattle, Eliza said. Not if we want to make it through winter. I know. So we need to guard the herd. Someone needs to be out there every night, watching. Gideon rubbed his face with both hands. I can't be in two places at once. Then we take turns. You, me, Jacob. Gideon looked up sharply. Jacob's 12. Jacob's old enough to hold a rifle and smart enough to know when something's wrong. And he's been carrying this family for longer than he should have to. Don't insult him by pretending otherwise. Gideon's jaw tightened. You don't know what you're asking. Yes, I do, Eliza said. I'm asking you to let your son help save his own home. Gideon stared at her for a long moment. Then he sighed and nodded. Fine, but he's not going out alone. Agreed. They started the night watch the next evening. Gideon took the first shift, Eliza took the second, and Jacob took the third, with Gideon riding back out to join him before dawn. It was exhausting, brutal work, and within 3 days, Eliza could feel the lack of sleep dragging at her bones. But it worked. No more cattle went missing. No more fences got cut. For 2 weeks, the ranch was quiet. Eliza used the time to push forward with the other repairs. She mended clothes, patched the chicken coop, reorganized the barn, and kept the garden growing despite the drought. The boys helped when they could, but they were just as tired as she was. It was Thomas who noticed the pattern first. They're watching us, he said one afternoon while he and Eliza were hauling water from the creek. Eliza stopped walking. Who? I don't know, but I've seen someone on the ridge twice now, just sitting there on a horse, watching. Did you tell your father? Thomas nodded. He said not to worry about it. But you are worried. Wouldn't you be? Eliza looked at the boy, 9 years old, serious-faced, and far too aware of how fragile everything around him was. Yeah, she said. I would be. That night, Eliza took her shift on watch and rode out to the north pasture with a rifle across her lap, and her eyes scanning the ridgeline. The moon was nearly full, bright enough to see by, and the land stretched out around her in shades of silver and black. She didn't see anyone, but she felt it, that prickling sensation on the back of her neck that told her she wasn't alone. Someone was watching. When her shift ended and Gideon came to relieve her, she told him what Thomas had said. Gideon's face went hard. I'll handle it. How? I'll figure it out. That's not a plan. It's the best I've got. Eliza wanted to argue, but she could see the exhaustion written into every line of Gideon's face. So she just nodded, handed him the rifle, and rode back to the house. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in her small room and listened to the wind and thought about the watcher on the ridge and the way Gideon's hands shook when he thought no one was looking. This couldn't go on. Something had to give. It did, 3 days later. Eliza was in the barn mucking out stalls when she heard shouting from the yard. She dropped the pitchfork and ran outside to find a man on horseback blocking the path to the house. He was older, maybe 50, with a thick gray beard and a black coat that looked expensive even from a distance. Gideon stood between the man and the house, his rifle held loose at his side but ready. I said, "Get off my property, Boone," Gideon said, his voice low and dangerous. So this was Silas Boone. Eliza moved closer, staying just outside Boone's line of sight. Behind her, she could hear the boys gathering near the porch. Boone smiled, a slow, cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Now, Gideon, there's no need for hostility. I came here to make you an offer." "I'm not interested. You haven't heard it yet." "Don't need to. The answer's no." Boone's smile widened. "You're a stubborn man. I respect that. But stubbornness doesn't pay debts. And from what I hear, you've got plenty of those." "My debts are my business." "Not when they affect the whole county." Boone leaned forward in his saddle. "You're sitting on the best water source for 50 miles. That creek running through your property could support 3 times the cattle you've got. Hell, it could support a whole town if someone knew how to manage it properly. Someone like you." "Exactly like me." Gideon's grip on the rifle tightened. "I'm not selling. I'm offering you a fair price. More than fair, considering the state of this place." "I said no." Boone's expression hardened. "You're going to lose this ranch, Gideon. One way or another. You can walk away with money in your pocket and your pride intact, or you can watch it crumble around you while your boys go hungry. Your choice. Get off my property." For a moment, Eliza thought Boone was going to push it. She could see the calculation in his eyes, the way he was weighing his options. Then he shrugged and pulled his horse around. "Suit yourself. But when this place falls apart, and it will, don't come crying to me." He rode off slowly, deliberately, like he had all the time in the world. Gideon stood there watching until Boone was out of sight. Then he lowered the rifle and walked toward the barn without a word. Eliza followed him. She found him in the back corner of the barn, leaning against the wall with his head down and his shoulders shaking. For a second, she thought he was crying. Then she realized he was laughing, a harsh, bitter sound that had nothing to do with humor. "He's right," Gideon said without looking up. "I am going to lose this place." "No, you're not. You don't know that." "Yes, I do." Eliza stepped closer. "Because you're not alone anymore. And because I'm not going to let you give up." Gideon finally looked up at her. His eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted. "Why do you care so much?" Eliza thought about lying, thought about giving him some noble reason that would make her sound better than she was. But she was tired of lies. "Because I don't have anywhere else to go," she said. "Because if this place falls apart, I'm right back where I started, standing on an auction block waiting for someone to buy me. And I'd rather fight than go back to that." Gideon stared at her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Okay. Okay? Yeah, okay. We fight." It wasn't a rousing speech. It wasn't inspirational, but it was real, and that was enough. Over the next week, things got worse before they got better. 2 more sections of fence got cut. A hay bale caught fire in the middle of the night. Gideon managed to put it out before it spread, but the message was clear. And then one morning, Eliza woke to find the word "leave" painted in crude red letters across the side of the barn. The boys were terrified. Thomas stopped sleeping. Samuel followed Eliza everywhere, clinging to her skirt like a much younger child. And Jacob got quiet. Not the normal kind of quiet, but the dangerous kind. The kind that meant he was thinking and planning and holding something back. Eliza found him in the barn one afternoon, staring at the painted letters with an expression that made her chest tighten. "Don't," she said. Jacob looked at her. "Don't what?" "Whatever you're thinking, don't." You don't know what I'm thinking. Yes, I do. You're thinking about going after whoever's doing this. You're thinking about revenge. Jacob's jaw clenched. Someone has to do something. And someone will. But it's not going to be you. Why not? Because you're 12 years old and you deserve to be a kid for a little while longer. I stopped being a kid when Ma died, Jacob said flatly. The words hit Eliza like a punch to the gut. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wrong. But she couldn't, because he wasn't. I know, she said quietly. I know you did, and that's not fair. But getting yourself killed trying to prove something won't make it any better. Jacob looked away. Pa's going to lose the ranch. Maybe, maybe not. You don't believe that. I believe that giving up guarantees we lose. Fighting gives us a chance. Jacob was quiet for a long time. Then he said, what if fighting isn't enough? Then we lose. But at least we'll lose knowing we tried. Jacob nodded slowly, and Eliza saw some of the tension leave his shoulders. Okay, he said. Okay. That night, Gideon called a family meeting. He didn't use those words. He just told everyone to sit at the table after dinner. But that's what it was. The boys sat quietly, watching their father with wary eyes. Eliza stood near the stove, giving them space but staying close enough to hear. Gideon cleared his throat. I know things have been hard lately. I know you're scared, and I'm sorry for that. Samuel's eyes filled with tears. Thomas stared at the table. Jacob watched his father with that sharp, unreadable expression. But I need you to know that we're not giving up, Gideon continued. No matter what Boone does, no matter what happens. This is our home, and we're going to fight for it. How? Jacob asked. Gideon hesitated. Then he said, I don't know yet, but we'll figure it out. That's not good enough, Jacob said. Jacob, we'll... No. Jacob stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. It's not good enough, Pa. You keep saying we're going to fight, but you don't have a plan. You're just hoping something will change, but it won't. Not unless we make it change. Gideon's face went red. You don't get to talk to me like that. Then start acting like you know what you're doing. The silence that followed was sharp and painful. Thomas looked like he wanted to disappear. Samuel started crying quietly, and Gideon stared at his oldest son like he'd just been slapped. Then Gideon stood up, walked out of the house, and slammed the door behind him. Jacob sat back down, his face pale and his hands shaking. I shouldn't have said that, he whispered. No, Eliza said gently. You shouldn't have. But you're not wrong. Jacob looked up at her, surprised. Your father's doing the best he can, Eliza continued. But the best he can isn't good enough right now, and someone needs to tell him that. So what do we do? Eliza looked at the three boys sitting at the table, exhausted, scared, and trying so hard to hold everything together, and made another decision. We come up with a plan, she said, and then we make your father listen. She spent the next 2 days working on it. She went through the ranch books again, calculated every expense, mapped out every asset. She talked to Jacob about the cattle, about the land, about what Boone wanted and why. She sent Thomas into town to listen to gossip and came back with useful information about Boone's business dealings. She even got Samuel to help by drawing a map of the property, marking every fence line, every water source, every vulnerable point. And slowly, a plan took shape. It wasn't perfect. It relied on too many variables and too much luck. But it was better than nothing. When she was ready, she laid it all out on the kitchen table and called Gideon in. He came reluctantly, his face still tight with anger from the argument with Jacob. What's this? He asked. A plan, Eliza said. Sit down and listen. Gideon sat. The boys gathered around the table, and Eliza started talking. She explained how they could consolidate the herd into the south pasture, which was easier to defend. She showed him how they could cut expenses further by trading more labor for supplies. She outlined a strategy for documenting every incident, every cut fence, every missing cow, every act of sabotage, so they'd have evidence if they ever got someone to listen. And then she got to the hardest part. We need to go public, she said. We need to tell everyone in the county what Boone's doing. Gideon frowned. No one will care. They will if it affects them. Boone doesn't just want your ranch, he wants control of the water. If he gets it, he'll charge every rancher in the county for access. That means everyone has a stake in stopping him. You think people will stand up to Boone? I think some of them will. Enough to make a difference. Gideon was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "And if you're wrong, then we're no worse off than we are now." Gideon looked at the papers spread across the table. He looked at his sons. He looked at Eliza. Then he nodded. "Okay, we'll try it." Jacob let out a breath he'd been holding. Thomas grinned. Samuel stopped crying for the first time in days, and Eliza felt something shift in the air, something fragile and uncertain, but real. They had a plan. They had a direction. And for the first time since she'd arrived at the Hale Ranch, Eliza thought maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. The morning they rode into Harper's Bend to spread the word about Boone's scheme, the sky looked like it was holding its breath. No clouds, no wind, just a pale gray dome pressing down on the world like a lid on a pot ready to boil over. Eliza sat next to Gideon on the wagon bench while the boys rode in back. Jacob kept his rifle across his knees, even though Gideon had told him 3 times it wasn't necessary. Thomas watched the road like he expected someone to jump out at them. Samuel had barely spoken since breakfast. "You sure about this?" Gideon asked quietly. Eliza looked at him. His jaw was tight, and his hands gripped the reins too hard. She knew what he was really asking. "Are you sure about dragging my family into a fight we might not win?" "No," she said, "but I'm sure doing nothing is worse." Gideon nodded and didn't ask again. They started at the general store because that's where people gathered to talk. The store sat on the corner of Main Street, a weathered building with a sagging awning and windows that hadn't been washed in months. Inside, it smelled like coffee and tobacco, and the particular kind of dust that only comes from things sitting too long on shelves. The owner, a man named Pritchard, with a round belly and suspicious eyes, looked up when they walked in. His expression went from neutral to wary in about half a second. "Gideon," he said carefully, "what brings you in?" "Need to talk to folks," Gideon said, "about Silas Boone." The store went quiet. 3 men standing near the back exchanged glances. A woman examining fabric near the window suddenly became very interested in a bolt of calico. Pritchard wiped his hands on his apron. "Don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," Eliza said. She stepped forward, letting the door swing shut behind her. "Boone's been sabotaging the Hale Ranch, cutting fences, stealing cattle, trying to force Gideon to sell so he can control the water rights." "That's a serious accusation," Pritchard said. "It's the truth." "You got proof?" Eliza pulled out the ledger she'd been keeping, every incident documented with dates, times, and damages. She set it on the counter hard enough to make Pritchard flinch. 6 months of sabotage, she said. All recorded, all pointing to Boone. Pritchard didn't touch the ledger. He just stared at it like it might bite him. "Even if that's true," he said slowly, "what do you expect us to do about it?" "Stand with us," Gideon said. "When Boone controls that water, he'll charge everyone for access. Your prices will go up. Your customers will suffer. This isn't just about my ranch. It's about the whole county." One of the men in the back, a rancher named Holloway, with gray hair and sun-damaged skin, cleared his throat. "Boone's got the law in his pocket," Holloway said. "Sheriff won't touch him. Judge won't touch him. What's standing with you going to accomplish except getting us on his bad side?" "Maybe nothing," Eliza said. "Or maybe it'll show him he can't just take whatever he wants." "Easy for you to say," the woman by the window spoke up. She was younger than Eliza, with brown hair pulled back in a bun and tired eyes. "You're not the one who'll lose your livelihood if Boone decides to make an example of you." "I've already lost everything once," Eliza said. "I stood on an auction block and watched my father sell me to pay his debts. So don't tell me I don't understand what it means to lose." The woman's face colored, but she didn't look away. "If Boone wins," Eliza continued, "it won't stop with the Hales. It never does. Men like him keep taking until someone makes them stop." Pritchard picked up the ledger, flipped through a few pages, then set it back down. "I'll think about it," he said. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. They had the same conversation 6 more times that day. At the blacksmith shop, at the livery, at the boarding house where traveling merchants stayed. Some people listened. Some people turned them away before they could finish talking. And some people looked scared enough that Eliza knew they'd never help, no matter what she said. By the time the sun started sinking toward the horizon, Eliza's throat was raw from talking and her feet hurt from walking, and she felt like they'd accomplished exactly nothing. We should head back, Gideon said. He looked as tired as she felt. One more stop, Eliza said. She led them to the edge of town, to a small house with a neat garden and curtains in the windows. Mrs. Morrison answered the door with flour on her hands and surprise on her face. Eliza? Jacob? What are you doing here? We need your help, Eliza said. Mrs. Morrison listened to the whole story standing in her doorway. She didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions, just listened with the kind of attention that made Eliza feel like every word mattered. When Eliza finished, Mrs. Morrison wiped her hands on her apron and nodded. I'll help, she said. Just like that? Gideon asked. Just like that. Mrs. Morrison looked at him with clear, steady eyes. Your wife helped me when my husband died. Brought food, watched my girls, never asked for anything in return. I owe your family. And besides, Boone's a bastard. Someone should have stood up to him years ago. Eliza felt something tight in her chest loosen just a little. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, Mrs. Morrison said. Thank me when this is over and we're all still standing. They rode home in the dark. The boys had fallen asleep in the back of the wagon, sprawled across each other like puppies. Gideon drove in silence, his face hard to read in the shadows. You think anyone else will help? He asked finally. I don't know, Eliza said, but Mrs. Morrison will. And maybe that's enough to start. One person isn't going to stop Boone. No. But one person can convince another, and another. That's how these things work. Gideon glanced at her. You sound like you've done this before. I haven't, but I've seen what happens when people stay quiet because they're scared. Nothing changes. Nothing gets better. And what happens when people speak up and get crushed for it? Eliza didn't have a good answer for that, so she just said, then at least they tried. Gideon made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something sadder. They made it back to the ranch just before midnight. Gideon carried Samuel inside while Jacob and Thomas stumbled toward their room half asleep. Eliza unhitched the horses and got them settled in the barn, then walked back to the house on legs that felt like they might give out. She found Gideon sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of whiskey in front of him. He wasn't drinking it, just staring at it like it held answers. You should sleep, Eliza said. Can't. You need to. Gideon finally looked up at her. You know what the worst part is? Eliza waited. Jacob was right, Gideon said, when he yelled at me. He was right. I've been hoping something would change without doing anything to make it change. I've been so buried in grief I couldn't see what was happening right in front of me. You were surviving, Eliza said. That's not the same as giving up. Feels the same. Eliza pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. Your wife died. You were left alone with 3 boys and a failing ranch, and no idea how to fix any of it. You did what you could. That's all anyone can do. It wasn't enough. Maybe not. But you're still here. Your boys are still here. The ranch is still standing. That counts for something. Gideon picked up the glass, took a small sip, then set it back down. Why are you really doing this? I told you. No, I want the real reason. Eliza hesitated. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, steady and patient. Because I'm tired of being powerless, she said finally. My whole life, things have happened to me. My father made bad decisions and I paid for them. I got sold like property because a man with money decided that was fair. I've spent 22 years watching other people control my life, and I'm done with it. So this is about you. Yes. And it's about your boys, and your ranch, and everyone else Boone's trying to crush. It can be about more than one thing. Gideon studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. All right, he said. Then let's make it count. The next 3 days were a blur of work and waiting. They moved the cattle to the south pasture like Eliza had planned. They reinforced the fences. They set up a rotation for night watches that didn't leave anyone too exhausted to function. And they waited to see if anyone in town would actually help. Mrs. Morrison showed up on the 4th day with her 2 daughters and a wagon full of supplies. Figured you could use some extra hands, she said. Her daughters, both in their 20s, both strong and capable, helped Eliza repair the chicken coop and plant a second garden plot. Mrs. Morrison herself spent the afternoon baking bread and cooking a meal that was the first real food the Hale family had eaten in weeks. That night, sitting around a table that actually felt full, Samuel smiled for the first time in days. "This is good," he said, his mouth full of bread. "Don't talk with your mouth full," Jacob said automatically. "You're not Ma," Samuel shot back, but there was no heat in it. Mrs. Morrison looked at Gideon. "Your boys are good kids." "They are," Gideon said quietly. "You're doing right by them, even when it doesn't feel like it." Gideon didn't respond, but Eliza saw his jaw tighten with emotion he was trying to hold back. 2 days later, Holloway showed up. He didn't say much, just rode his horse to the edge of the property and studied the fence line with a critical eye. "Heard you've been having trouble," he said when Gideon walked out to meet him. "You heard right." Holloway was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've got some extra wire. And some posts, if you want them." "I can't pay—" "Didn't ask you to." Holloway looked at Gideon with something that might have been respect. "Sometimes a man's got to pick a side. I'm picking yours." He brought the materials the next day, and he brought his 2 sons with him. They spent the afternoon reinforcing the north fence line, working in silence, but working hard. When they finished, Holloway tipped his hat to Eliza and said, "Your idea, talking to folks. It was good." "It's working?" Eliza asked, surprised. "Some. People are talking, and some of them are starting to think maybe Boone's been getting away with too much for too long." "That's something." "It's more than something," Holloway said. "It's a start." But starts don't always lead to finishes. The fire came on a Tuesday night, 3 weeks after they'd started spreading the word about Boone. The sky had been building toward a storm all day, dark clouds rolling in from the west, the air thick and electric. But the rain never came. Just lightning, flashing across the sky in jagged white lines, and wind that made the trees bend and creak. Eliza was on watch in the south pasture when she saw the first glow on the horizon. It was small at first, barely noticeable, just a faint orange smudge against the dark sky. Then it grew. Fast. She kicked her horse into a gallop and rode hard toward the house, shouting as loud as she could. "Fire! Fire on the ridge!" Gideon burst out of the house before she even made it to the yard, pulling his boots on as he ran. Jacob was right behind him, then Thomas, then Samuel stumbling out in his nightshirt. "Where?" Gideon shouted. "North Ridge, it's spreading fast." Gideon swore and ran for the barn. "Jacob, get the horses." "Thomas, wake Mrs. Morrison and her girls. Samuel, stay in the house." "I can help," Samuel yelled. "You can stay in the house." Gideon disappeared into the barn and came back out leading his horse, already saddled. Eliza dismounted and ran to help Jacob with the other horses. Her hands were shaking and her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. "How bad is it?" Jacob asked, his voice tight. "Bad," Eliza said. "The grass is dry and the wind's pushing it toward the cattle." Jacob's face went pale. "If it reaches the herd—" "It won't. We'll stop it." "How?" Eliza didn't have an answer for that. She just grabbed the reins of the second horse and pulled herself into the saddle. By the time they reached the North Ridge, the fire was a living thing. It roared across the dry grassland in a wave of orange and red, eating everything in its path. The heat hit Eliza like a wall, even from 50 yards away. The cattle were panicking. She could hear them bellowing and see their dark shapes moving frantically near the fence line. If they stampeded toward the broken section of fence on the east side, they'd scatter across the county and they'd lose everything. Gideon was already riding toward the herd, shouting over the noise of the fire. "We need to turn them south, away from the flames." "The fence won't hold," Jacob yelled back. "Then we hold them ourselves." Eliza didn't wait for more instructions. She rode hard toward the eastern edge of the herd, waving her arms and shouting, trying to turn the panicked cattle back toward the center. It was chaos. The smoke burned her eyes and throat. The cattle were everywhere, massive shapes looming out of the darkness and nearly running her down. She saw Thomas trying to do the same thing on the other side, his horse dancing nervously as a steer charged past. She saw Mrs. Morrison's daughters beating at the edge of the fire with wet blankets, trying to slow it down. And then she saw Samuel. He was standing near the fence line, right in the path of the stampeding cattle, waving his arms like he thought he could stop them alone. "Samuel!" Eliza screamed. "Get out of there!" Samuel didn't hear her. Or if he did, he didn't listen. He just kept waving his arms, tears streaming down his face, screaming at the cattle to stop. Eliza kicked her horse forward and rode straight into the herd. She leaned down, grabbed Samuel by the back of his nightshirt, and hauled him up onto the saddle in front of her. He was sobbing and shaking and clutching at her arms. "I wanted to help," he gasped. "I wanted to help." "You did," Eliza said fiercely. "Now hold on." She wheeled the horse around and rode back toward the center of the herd. Samuel clutched tight against her chest. Behind them, she could hear Gideon shouting orders, Jacob and Thomas working together to turn the cattle, the fire crackling and roaring like something furious. And then, just when Eliza thought they were going to lose the whole herd, the wind shifted. The fire turned back on itself, pushed by a sudden gust from the east. The flames slowed, then stalled, then started to die as they ran out of fuel. The cattle, sensing the danger receding, stopped running. They stood in nervous clusters, their eyes rolling white, but they stopped. Eliza pulled her horse to a halt and just sat there, breathing hard, feeling Samuel shake against her chest. Gideon rode up beside her. His face was black with soot, and his eyes were red from smoke. "Everyone all right?" he asked. "I think so," Eliza managed. "Samuel?" "He's okay, just scared." Gideon reached over and put a hand on Samuel's head. "You shouldn't have been out here." "I wanted to help," Samuel said again, his voice small. "I know, but you could have been killed." Samuel didn't respond. He just pressed his face against Eliza's shoulder and cried quietly. They spent the next 2 hours making sure the fire was completely out and the cattle were secured. By the time they made it back to the house, the sky was starting to lighten in the east and everyone was so exhausted they could barely stand. Mrs. Morrison made coffee. No one spoke. They just sat around the kitchen table, drinking in silence, too tired for words. It was Jacob who finally broke the quiet. "That wasn't lightning," he said. Everyone looked at him. "The fire," Jacob continued. "It didn't start from lightning. Lightning was hitting all over, but the fire started in one spot, right at the base of the ridge." "You sure?" Gideon asked. "I'm sure." Gideon's face went hard. "Boone." "Had to be." "We don't know that," Mrs. Morrison said carefully. "Who else would it be?" Jacob's voice was sharp with anger. "Who else wants us gone that badly?" No one had an answer for that. Gideon stood up slowly. He walked to the window and stared out at the scorched land beyond, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "He's trying to burn us out," Gideon said quietly. "And if that doesn't work, he'll try something worse." "So what do we do?" Thomas asked. Gideon turned around. His face was set and determined in a way Eliza hadn't seen before. "We stopped playing defense," he said, "and we hit back." The room went silent. "How?" Eliza asked. Gideon looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something that had been missing for a long time. Not hope, exactly, but something close to it. Something fierce and unbroken. "We take this to court," he said. "We file a formal complaint. We get every rancher who's had trouble with Boone to testify. We make it so public and so loud that even the sheriff and the judge can't ignore it." "That's risky," Mrs. Morrison said. "Everything's risky." Gideon looked around the table at his sons, at Mrs. Morrison and her daughters, at Eliza. "But we've got witnesses now. We've got documentation. We've got people willing to stand with us. That's more than we had before." "What if we lose?" Thomas asked quietly. "Then we lose," Gideon said. "But at least we'll go down fighting." Eliza felt something stir in her chest. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. "When do we file?" she asked. "Tomorrow," Gideon said. "We go to the county seat, we find a lawyer, and we file. Before Boone has time to figure out what we're doing." Jacob stood up. "I'm coming with you." I'm coming," Jacob said firmly. "This is my family too. I get a say." Gideon looked at his son for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right, you come." They left at dawn the next morning, Gideon, Eliza, and Jacob, with Mrs. Morrison staying behind to watch the younger boys in the ranch. The ride to the county seat took 4 hours, and by the time they arrived, Eliza's back was sore, and her nerves were frayed. The county seat was a town called Riverside, bigger than Harper's Bend, but not by much. The courthouse sat in the center of a dusty square, a 2-story building with white columns and windows that looked down on everything like judging eyes. Finding a lawyer willing to take their case turned out to be harder than Eliza expected. The first three they talked to turned them away the moment they heard Boone's name. The fourth listened for 5 minutes before saying he didn't handle property disputes. The fifth laughed in their faces. It was almost noon when they finally found someone. His name was Marcus Brennan, and his office was above a dry goods store on the edge of town. The sign on the door was faded and crooked, and when they walked in, they found him sitting at a desk covered in papers, eating a sandwich that looked like it had seen better days. "Help you?" Brennan asked around a mouthful of bread. "We need a lawyer," Gideon said. Brennan swallowed. "For what?" "To file a complaint against Silas Boone." Brennan set his sandwich down slowly. "You serious?" "As a heart attack." Brennan looked them over. A dirt-streaked rancher, a woman in a worn dress, and a 12-year-old boy trying to look older than he was. He didn't laugh, which was something. "Sit," he said. "Tell me everything." They did. It took over an hour. Brennan listened without interrupting, taking notes on a piece of paper that was already covered in scribbles. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied them. "You know this is going to get ugly," he said. "We know," Gideon said. "Boone's got money, he's got connections, and he's not going to take this lying down. We're not asking him to lie down, we're asking him to stop." Brennan smiled a little at that. "All right, I'll take your case, but I'm going to need testimony from every person who's willing to speak against Boone, and I'm going to need documentation for everything, every stolen cow, every cut fence, every incident." "We've got it," Eliza said, pulling out the ledger. Brennan took it, flipped through the pages, and let out a low whistle. "This is detailed. I kept track." "Good, because this is the only thing that might make a judge listen." He closed the ledger and looked at Gideon. "You understand that even with this, we might lose." "I understand." "And you're willing to risk it anyway?" "Yes." Brennan nodded. "Then we'll file tomorrow morning, and then we'll see what Boone does." They stayed in Riverside that night, renting a room above a boarding house that smelled like cabbage and regret. Jacob fell asleep almost immediately, sprawled across one of the narrow beds. Gideon sat by the window, staring out at the dark street below. Eliza lay in the other bed, too wired to sleep, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The auction block, the ranch, the boys, the fire, and now a lawsuit that might save them or destroy them completely. "You awake?" Gideon asked quietly. "Yeah." "You ever regret coming here?" Eliza thought about that, about the exhaustion and the fear and the constant fight to keep everything from falling apart. "No," she said, "not once." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm glad you're here." It was the first time he'd said anything like that. The first time he'd acknowledged that she was more than just hired help. "Me too," Eliza said. And lying there in the dark, listening to Jacob's soft breathing and Gideon's quiet presence, Eliza realized it was true. She was glad, despite everything, because for the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving. She was fighting for something. They filed the complaint at 9 o'clock the next morning. Brennan walked them through the courthouse doors like he owned the place, past clerks who looked up with curious eyes and down a hallway that smelled like old paper and furniture polish. The filing clerk, a thin man with spectacles that kept sliding down his nose, took the documents with shaking hands when he saw Boone's name written across the top. "You sure about this?" he asked Brennan. "Just file it," Brennan said. The clerk stamped the papers with more force than necessary and handed Brennan a receipt. "Hearings set for 3 weeks from today, Judge Calhoun presiding." "Calhoun's fair," Brennan said as they walked back outside. "Strict, but fair. If we can prove our case, he'll listen." "And if we can't?" Gideon asked. "Then we're done." They rode back to the ranch in silence. Jacob sat rigid in the saddle, his face set in an expression that made him look far older than 12. Gideon stared straight ahead, his jaw working like he was chewing through every possible outcome, and Eliza felt a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach with every mile they covered. By the time they reached the ranch, word had already spread. Mrs. Morrison met them at the gate with Thomas and Samuel behind her, all three of them looking tense. "Holloway was here," Mrs. Morrison said. "Said Boone knows. He's already threatening anyone who agreed to testify." Gideon's face went hard. "How does he know already?" Someone at the courthouse must have told him. Brennan had warned them about this possibility, but Eliza still felt a surge of anger. Who's backing out? Two families so far, the Hendersons and the Pratts, said they can't afford to make an enemy out of Boone. Damn it, Gideon muttered. Holloway's still in, Mrs. Morrison continued, and so are we. And the Carlsons sent word they'll testify too. It wasn't much, but it was something. Over the next 2 weeks, the pressure mounted. Someone poisoned 3 of their chickens. Someone left a dead coyote on the porch with a note that said, "Next time it'll be something you care about." And someone, Eliza suspected it was one of Boone's men but couldn't prove it, started a rumor in town that Gideon was unfit to raise his boys and that the court should take them away for their own safety. That last one hit harder than anything else. Samuel heard it from a kid in town and came home crying so hard he made himself sick. Thomas got into a fistfight with a boy who repeated the rumor and came back with a black eye and bloody knuckles. And Jacob stopped sleeping. Eliza would wake in the middle of the night and see lamplight under his door, hear him pacing back and forth, back and forth. He's going to break, Mrs. Morrison said quietly one evening as she and Eliza washed dishes. That boy's carrying too much. I know, Eliza said, but I don't know how to make him stop. You can't. He's his father's son. He'll carry it until it crushes him or until the fight's over. That's not fair to him. Fair's got nothing to do with it. Eliza dried the last plate and set it on the shelf, her hands aching from the hot water. Through the kitchen window, she could see Gideon and Jacob working on the fence line, their silhouettes dark against the setting sun. They moved in sync, father and son, both of them carrying weight they shouldn't have to carry. Boone's not going to stop, Eliza said. Even if we win in court, he'll keep coming. Probably, Mrs. Morrison agreed. Men like him don't know how to quit. So what do we do? Mrs. Morrison looked at her with tired, knowing eyes. We keep fighting, because the alternative is letting him win. And I've buried one good man already. I won't stand by and watch another family get destroyed. 3 days before the hearing, Silas Boone showed up at the ranch again. This time, he didn't come alone. He brought 6 men with him, all of them armed, all of them wearing the kind of cold expressions that said they'd done this before and knew how it ended. Gideon met them in the yard with his rifle. Eliza stood on the porch with the shotgun Mrs. Morrison had taught her to use, and Jacob positioned himself near the barn with his own rifle across his knees. Thomas and Samuel were locked inside the house with strict instructions not to come out no matter what they heard. Boone sat on his horse like a king surveying conquered territory. He smiled when he saw the guns, a slow, amused expression that made Eliza's skin crawl. Now, Gideon, Boone said, is that any way to greet a neighbor? You're not my neighbor, Gideon said. You're a thief and a coward, and you're not welcome here. Strong words from a man about to lose everything. Boone leaned forward in his saddle. I came to give you one last chance. Drop the complaint and I'll buy your ranch at a fair price. You can walk away with enough money to start over somewhere else. Your boys won't have to grow up watching their father fail. Get off my property. Think about your sons, Gideon. Think about what you're putting them through. The rumors, the threats, the constant fear. Is your pride really worth their suffering? Eliza saw Gideon's finger twitch on the trigger. She took a step forward, keeping the shotgun pointed at Boone's men. He told you to leave, she said. So leave. Boone's gaze shifted to her. His smile widened. Ah, yes, the woman from the auction. Tell me, does Gideon make you feel like you're worth more than $43? Or are you starting to realize you're just another thing he bought to make his life easier? The only thing making anyone's life harder is you, Eliza said. Now turn around and ride out before someone gets hurt. Is that a threat? It's a promise. For a moment, Boone's smile slipped. His eyes went cold and flat. Then he straightened in his saddle and pulled his horse around. 3 days, he said. That's all you have left. And when the judge throws your case out, I'll be waiting. And I won't be offering to buy anymore. I'll just take. He rode off with his men following. They didn't hurry. They took their time, making sure Gideon knew they could come back anytime they wanted. When they were finally out of sight, Gideon lowered his rifle and let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped in his chest for hours. That was close, he said. Too close, Eliza agreed. Jacob came walking over from the barn, his face pale. He's going to try something. Before the hearing. I know, Gideon said. So what do we do? Gideon looked at his son, then at Eliza, then back at the road where Boone had disappeared. We don't give him the chance. That night, they packed everything important into the wagon and moved it to Mrs. Morrison's farm. The ranch books, the documentation, anything that could be used as evidence. Mrs. Morrison's daughters helped, working quickly and efficiently, and by midnight, everything was secure. You should stay here too, Mrs. Morrison said. All of you. Until the hearing's over. Can't, Gideon said. If we leave the ranch unattended, Boone will burn it to the ground. Then leave the boys with me. No, Jacob said before Gideon could respond. We're not splitting up. Jacob. No, Pa. We're not. If you're staying, we're staying. Thomas and Samuel nodded in agreement, their faces set with the same stubborn determination. Gideon looked at his sons, and Eliza saw something in his expression shift. Pride, maybe. Or resignation. Or maybe just the realization that his boys weren't children anymore, no matter how much he wished they were. All right, he said quietly. We stay together. They spent the next 2 days fortifying the ranch. They boarded up windows, moved supplies into the cellar, set up watch posts around the property. Holloway came by with his sons and helped build a fire break around the house in case Boone tried to burn them out again. Mrs. Morrison brought food and ammunition and refused to leave even when Gideon told her she should. You've got 3 boys, she said. I've got 2 daughters. We all look after our own. The night before the hearing, Eliza couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed listening to the house creak and settle, listening to footsteps on the porch where Gideon was keeping watch, listening to the wind rattle the windows like it was trying to get in. She got up finally and walked downstairs. Gideon was sitting on the porch steps with his rifle across his knees, staring out at the dark landscape. Can't sleep either? He asked without turning around. No, Eliza said. She sat down next to him, wrapping her shawl tighter against the cold. They sat in silence for a while. Then Gideon said, I need to tell you something. Eliza waited. If tomorrow goes wrong, he said slowly, if Boone wins, or if something happens at the courthouse, I need you to take the boys and leave. Take them to Mrs. Morrison's, or take them further if you have to, but get them away from here. Gideon, I'm serious, Eliza. If I go down, I don't want them going down with me. Nothing's going to happen to you. You don't know that. Neither do you. Gideon turned to look at her. In the faint moonlight, his face looked haggard and worn. I'm not good at this. Any of this. Being a father, running a ranch, asking for help. But you've made it better. You've made all of it better, and I need you to know that. Eliza felt something tighten in her throat. You're better at it than you think. I'm not. But I'm trying. He paused. And I'm grateful for everything you've done, everything you've been for this family. I didn't do it to be thanked. I know, but I'm thanking you anyway. Eliza looked out into the dark land stretching away from them, at the fences they'd mended and the pastures they'd fought to keep. She thought about the auction block and her father's shame and the $43 that had bought her a year of her life. And she realized that somewhere along the way, it had stopped being about obligation or survival or even pride. It had become about family, a broken, stubborn, imperfect family that had somehow learned to hold together. We're going to win tomorrow, she said. You sound sure. I have to be, because the alternative is unacceptable. Gideon smiled a little at that. You're fierce, you know that? I've had to be. I'm glad you are. They sat together until the first hint of dawn started lightening the eastern sky. Then Gideon stood, stretched, and offered Eliza his hand. Come on, he said. We've got a fight to win. The courthouse was packed when they arrived. Every seat in the gallery was filled, people standing in the back and spilling out into the hallway. Eliza recognized some faces from town. Pritchard from the general store, the woman from the fabric shop, the blacksmith, and the livery owner. She saw Holloway and his family sitting near the front. She saw Mrs. Morrison and her daughters. And she saw Silas Boone sitting at the plaintiff's table with 3 lawyers in expensive suits flanking him like guards. Brennan met them at the door, looking harried but determined. Judge Calhoun's tough, but he's fair. Let me do the talking unless he asks you a direct question. And whatever you do, don't lose your temper. Easy for you to say, Gideon muttered. I know it's not easy, but Boone's going to try to provoke you. Don't give him the satisfaction. They took their seats at the defendant's table. Jacob sat behind them with Thomas and Samuel on either side. All three boys dressed in their best clothes and looking terrified. Judge Calhoun entered from a side door, a tall man with white hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. Everyone stood. "Be seated," Calhoun said. His voice carried across the courtroom like a hammer strike. "We're here to address the complaint filed by Gideon Hale against Silas Boone regarding allegations of property damage, livestock theft, and intimidation. Mr. Brennan, you may begin." Brennan stood. "Your Honor, over the past 6 months, my client has suffered systematic sabotage designed to force him to sell his property. We have documentation of every incident, testimony from witnesses, and clear evidence pointing to Mr. Boone as the perpetrator." One of Boone's lawyers stood immediately. "Your Honor, these are baseless accusations from a man who's failed to manage his own affairs and is now looking for someone to blame." "I'll decide what's baseless," Calhoun said. "Sit down. Mr. Brennan, present your evidence." Brennan called Gideon to the stand first. Gideon walked up slowly, was sworn in, and sat down with his hands gripped tight on the armrests. "Mr. Hale," Brennan said, "please tell the court what's been happening at your ranch." Gideon took a breath. Then he started talking. He described the cut fences, the stolen cattle, the fire on the ridge. He talked about the threats and the poisoned chickens and the dead coyote on the porch. His voice was steady, controlled, but Eliza could see the tension in his shoulders. When he finished, Boone's lead lawyer stood to cross-examine. "Mr. Hale," the lawyer said smoothly, "you've suffered some unfortunate incidents. But can you prove that my client was responsible for any of them?" "Who else would it be?" Gideon asked. "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer that makes sense." "Your Honor," the lawyer said, "this is pure speculation. My client is a respected businessman." "Who's been buying up land for years?" Gideon interrupted. "Who's made it clear he wants my property? Who's threatened me multiple times?" "Alleged threats," the lawyer corrected. "Do you have proof?" Gideon's jaw clenched. "I have witnesses. Witnesses with their own grievances against my client, I'm sure." "Objection," Brennan said. "Counsel is testifying." "Sustained," Calhoun said. "Move on." The cross-examination went on for another 20 minutes, the lawyer picking apart every detail, questioning every claim, making it sound like Gideon was paranoid or incompetent or both. By the time Gideon stepped down, his face was flushed and his hands were shaking. Brennan called Holloway next, then Mrs. Morrison, then 2 other ranchers who'd agreed to testify. Each of them described similar incidents on their own properties: cut fences, missing livestock, intimidation. Each of them pointed to Boone as the source, and each time, Boone's lawyers tore them apart on cross-examination. By noon, Eliza could feel the case slipping away. The judge's expression was unreadable, but the jury, 6 men from the county, all of them looking uncomfortable, kept glancing at Boone with something that looked like fear. During the lunch recess, Brennan pulled Gideon aside. "We need something stronger. The testimony's good, but it's not enough. They're making you all look like you're just bitter neighbors with a grudge." "What do you suggest?" Gideon asked. "I don't know. Unless you've got concrete proof." "We do," Jacob said. Everyone turned to look at him. "Jacob," Gideon said carefully, "what are you talking about?" Jacob reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I found this 2 weeks ago, in the north pasture near where the fire started. I didn't say anything because I didn't know if it mattered." He handed the paper to Brennan, who unfolded it and read quickly. His eyes widened. "This is a receipt," Brennan said, "for kerosene, purchased the day before the fire, signed by Emmett Cross." "Who's Emmett Cross?" Eliza asked. "One of Boone's men," Holloway said. "Works as his foreman." Brennan looked at Jacob. "Where exactly did you find this?" "Right where the fire started. It must have fallen out of someone's pocket." "This changes everything," Brennan said. He turned to Gideon. "I need to call Jacob to testify." "No," Gideon said immediately. "He's 12 years old. I'm not putting him through that." Jacob started. "No, you've already done enough." "Mr. Hale," Brennan said, "this receipt directly ties Boone's man to the arson. Without it, we're going to lose. With it, we have a fighting chance." Gideon looked at his son. Jacob looked back, his expression steady and determined. "I can do this," Jacob said. "I want to do this. Jacob, Pa, please, let me help." The silence stretched between them. Then Gideon nodded slowly, his face full of pain. "All right," he said. "All right." When court resumed, Brennan called Jacob to the stand. The boy walked up with his back straight and his chin high, but Eliza could see his hands trembling as he was sworn in. "Jacob," Brennan said gently, "can you tell the court what you found 2 weeks ago?" Jacob described finding the receipt, where it was, what it said. He handed it to Brennan, who entered it as evidence and passed it to the judge. Calhoun examined it carefully. "This receipt is dated the day before the fire on the Hale property." "Yes, Your Honor," Brennan said. "Purchased by Emmett Cross, Mr. Boone's foreman. Kerosene. Enough to start a significant blaze." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Boone's lawyers conferred quickly, looking worried. "Your Honor," the lead lawyer said, standing, "this proves nothing. My client's foreman may have purchased kerosene for legitimate ranch purposes." "On the Hale property," Brennan interrupted, "where it was found at the exact location where a fire started the next day?" "Circumstantial." "It's evidence," Brennan shot back. "Direct evidence tying your client's employee to arson." Calhoun banged his gavel. "That's enough. Mr. Cross will be called to testify. This court is adjourned until tomorrow morning." They walked out of the courthouse into the late afternoon sun. Jacob was pale and shaking, and Thomas and Samuel crowded close to him like they were afraid he might collapse. "You did good," Gideon said quietly. "I'm proud of you." Jacob nodded, but didn't respond. He looked exhausted. That night, they stayed at the boarding house in Riverside again. No one slept well. Eliza lay awake listening to footsteps in the hall and voices drifting up from the street below and the constant gnawing worry that something would go wrong. The next morning, Emmett Cross didn't show up to court. "He's disappeared," Brennan said grimly. "Probably ran the moment he heard about the receipt." "So what does that mean?" Gideon asked. "It means the jury's going to see that as good as a confession." But Boone's lawyers had one more card to play. When court reconvened, the lead lawyer stood and said, "Your Honor, we'd like to file a countercomplaint." Calhoun frowned. "On what grounds?" "Child endangerment. We believe Mr. Hale's children are living in unsafe conditions, constant threats, violence, instability. We're requesting that the court remove the children from his custody pending a full investigation." The courtroom went dead silent. Eliza felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. She looked at Gideon and saw his face go white. "Your Honor," Brennan said, his voice tight, "this is a blatant attempt to intimidate my client." "Is there evidence to support this claim?" Calhoun asked. "The children have been present during multiple violent incidents," Boone's lawyer said. "They've been exposed to threats, arson, and armed confrontations. Any reasonable person would question whether Mr. Hale is fit to protect them." "Because of what your client has done," Brennan shouted. "That's unproven," the lawyer said calmly. Calhoun looked at the three boys sitting in the gallery. His expression was grave. "I'll hear testimony on this matter," he said, starting with the children themselves. Eliza's heart sank. They called Thomas first. He walked up to the stand with his fists clenched and his face set in a scowl. When the lawyer asked if he felt safe at home, Thomas said yes. When the lawyer asked if he'd been scared during the fire, Thomas said yes, but that his father had protected them. When the lawyer asked if he'd rather live somewhere safer, Thomas said there was nowhere safer than with his family. They called Samuel next. He barely whispered his answers, but the message was the same. He wanted to stay with his father. Then they called Jacob. Jacob sat in the witness chair and looked directly at Boone's lawyer with those sharp, unflinching eyes. "Jacob," the lawyer said, "you're the oldest. You understand more than your brothers about the danger your family is in. Don't you think you'd all be better off somewhere else, somewhere stable?" "No," Jacob said. "You don't think you'd be safer?" "I think we'd be destroyed," Jacob interrupted. "Not by danger, by being split up. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to break us apart because you know that's the only way to beat us." "That's not—" "My mother died 2 years ago," Jacob continued, his voice rising. "And it almost killed my father. It almost killed all of us. We barely survived. And then Eliza came. And she didn't run like the others did. She stayed. She fought for us. She taught us that we don't give up just because things are hard. And now you want to take that away from us because you're scared we might actually win." "Jacob," the lawyer started. "I'm not finished," Jacob said. He was shaking now, but his voice was steady. My father's not perfect. He's made mistakes, but he loves us. And he's been fighting to keep us together and keep our home. That's not endangerment. That's family. And if you can't see that, then you don't understand what family means. The courtroom was silent. Even the judge looked stunned. Jacob stood up from the witness chair. We're staying together, all of us. And if you try to take us away, we'll fight you, because that's what families do. He walked back to his seat and sat down between his brothers. Samuel grabbed his hand. Thomas put an arm around his shoulders. And Gideon sat there with tears running down his face. Judge Calhoun didn't speak for a long time after Jacob finished. He just sat there behind his bench, his hands folded in front of him, his granite face unreadable. The courtroom stayed silent, everyone waiting, barely breathing. Finally, Calhoun turned to Boone's lawyer. Counselor, I've been a judge for 23 years. I've heard a lot of arguments in that time. Some good, some terrible, most somewhere in between. But what I just heard from that boy was the most honest testimony I've encountered in a decade. He paused, his voice hardening. And your attempt to weaponize child welfare laws to intimidate a family fighting to keep their home is one of the most cynical, contemptible tactics I've ever seen in my courtroom. Boone's lawyer opened his mouth, but Calhoun cut him off with a raised hand. I'm not finished. The countercomplaint is dismissed. Those children stay with their father. And if I find out anyone has attempted to interfere with this family outside of legal channels, I will personally see to it that charges are filed. The gallery erupted. People were standing, talking, some even applauding. Boone's face went red, then white, his hands clenched on the table in front of him. Calhoun banged his gavel hard enough to crack. Order! We're not done here! He waited until the room went quiet again. Now, regarding the original complaint, Mr. Brennan, your evidence is compelling but largely circumstantial. However, the receipt found at the arson site combined with Mr. Cross's failure to appear creates a reasonable inference of guilt. More importantly, the pattern of incidents documented by Miss Mercer demonstrates a clear campaign of intimidation. He turned to look directly at Silas Boone. Mr. Boone, I'm issuing a restraining order. You and your employees are prohibited from coming within 500 yards of the Hale property. Any further incidents will result in criminal charges. Additionally, I'm ordering a full investigation into your business practices, including your acquisition of water rights throughout this county. Your Honor, Boone's lead lawyer said, standing quickly. This is justice, Calhoun interrupted. Delayed perhaps, but justice nonetheless. This hearing is adjourned. He stood and walked out before anyone could respond. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Gideon turned around and pulled his sons into a hug so tight Eliza thought they might break. Samuel was crying, Thomas was laughing, and Jacob just stood there with his face pressed against his father's shoulder, finally letting himself be 12 years old again. Mrs. Morrison reached over and squeezed Eliza's hand. You did it, she said. Jacob did it, Eliza said. Her voice came out rough and unsteady. That boy saved his family. You taught him he could. Eliza looked at the Hales, at the way they were holding each other like they'd never let go, and felt something warm and painful expand in her chest. It wasn't victory exactly. It was something more complicated than that. Relief mixed with exhaustion, mixed with the terrifying realization that this had almost gone the other way. Brennan came over, grinning wider than Eliza had ever seen. We won. I can't believe it, but we actually won. What happens now? Gideon asked, finally releasing his sons. The restraining order goes into effect immediately. Boone can appeal, but given Cross's disappearance and the judge's language, I don't think he will. He knows he's beat. And the investigation? That could take months, but Calhoun's thorough. If there's dirt to find on Boone's water deals, he'll find it. They walked out of the courthouse into bright afternoon sunlight. A crowd had gathered on the steps, people from town and neighboring ranches, all of them talking at once. Some came up to shake Gideon's hand. Some clapped Jacob on the shoulder. Some just nodded at Eliza with expressions that said they understood more than they'd admit out loud. Pritchard from the general store pushed through the crowd. Hale, he said gruffly, I was wrong. About not helping. About staying quiet. That boy of yours shamed me today. Jacob shamed a lot of people, Gideon said, including me. Well, if you need anything, supplies, credit, whatever, you come see me. We take care of our own in this county. Should have remembered that sooner. Others echoed the sentiment. Offers of help. promises of support, apologies for not standing up earlier. It was awkward and imperfect, and probably too little too late, but it was real. As they loaded into the wagon to head home, Eliza saw Silas Boone standing at the edge of the courthouse steps, watching them with cold, flat eyes. His lawyers were talking to him urgently, but he wasn't listening. He was just staring at Gideon with an expression that said this wasn't over. "He's going to try something," Jacob said quietly from the back of the wagon. He'd seen Boone too. "Let him try," Gideon said. "The judge has eyes on him now. One wrong move and he's finished." "You think that'll stop him?" Gideon looked back at his son. "No, but I think he's going to be a lot more careful, and that buys us time." The ride home felt longer than it should have. Everyone was exhausted, drained by the emotional weight of the last 2 days. Samuel fell asleep against Thomas's shoulder. Jacob stared at the landscape passing by with unfocused eyes. Even Mrs. Morrison, riding in her own wagon behind them, looked worn down. When they finally reached the ranch, the sun was setting and the whole place was bathed in orange gold light. The house looked tired but solid. The barn leaned like it always had. The fences they'd mended held strong. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. That night, they had what Mrs. Morrison insisted on calling a celebration, even though nobody felt particularly celebratory. She cooked a real meal, chicken and potatoes and fresh bread, and they ate at the table that had once felt too empty and now felt full enough. Samuel talked more than he had in weeks. Thomas showed off his black eye like a badge of honor. Jacob was quiet, but not in the dangerous way, more in the way of someone who'd spent all his words and needed time to find more. And Gideon kept looking at his sons like he was seeing them for the first time in years. After dinner, Mrs. Morrison and her daughters went home, promising to return the next day to help with whatever needed doing. The boys went upstairs to bed, too tired to argue about it, and Eliza and Gideon were left alone in the kitchen with the remains of the meal between them. "I need to say something," Gideon said. He was standing near the window, his back to her, his shoulders tense. "All right. When you came here, I thought I was hiring help. Someone to cook and clean and make the house livable again. That's all I thought it was." Eliza waited. "But you didn't just make the house livable. You made it a home again. You fought for this family like you were born into it. You stood up to Boone when everyone else was too scared. You taught my boys that they could fight back instead of just surviving." He turned to face her, and his eyes were bright with emotion he wasn't bothering to hide. "And somewhere along the way, you stopped being the woman I hired and became the woman who saved us." Eliza's throat tightened. "I didn't save anyone. We saved each other." "That's what I'm trying to tell you." Gideon took a step closer. "You weren't just helping. You were part of this. You are part of this. And I don't want that to end when your contract runs out." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying marry me. Not because I bought your contract, not because you feel obligated, but because I choose you. And I think you've chosen us too." Eliza stared at him. 1,000 thoughts ran through her head at once. About the auction block and being property and swearing she'd never belong to anyone again. About the boys and the ranch and the feeling of finally having a place that mattered. About Gideon and how he'd changed from a broken, grieving man into someone who could stand up and fight. "I did choose you," she said finally. "I chose you the moment I decided to stay and fight instead of running. I chose you when I kept your books and mended your fences and stood on your porch with a shotgun. I've been choosing you every day since I got here." "Then marry me." "On one condition." Gideon looked wary. "What condition?" "We do it as equals, not as a man who bought a woman's labor, not as someone who owes someone else, but as two people who decided to build something together." Gideon smiled, a real smile, the first one Eliza had seen from him that reached all the way to his eyes. "Equals. I can live with that." "Then yes, I'll marry you." They got married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the ranch. Mrs. Morrison and her daughters came, along with Holloway and his family, the Carlsons, Pritchard from the general store, and a surprising number of other people from town who'd apparently decided the Hales were worth supporting after all. There was no fancy dress, no elaborate decorations, no grand speeches. Just Gideon and Eliza standing in the front yard under the cottonwood tree while a circuit preacher said the words that made it legal. Jacob stood next to his father as best man, looking solemn and proud. Thomas and Samuel sat in the front row, both of them grinning so wide it looked like their faces might split. When the preacher said, "You may kiss your bride," Gideon leaned in and kissed Eliza softly, carefully, like he was afraid she might disappear if he wasn't gentle enough. "You're stuck with us now," he whispered. "Good," Eliza whispered back. The guests clapped and cheered. Mrs. Morrison cried. Someone broke out a fiddle and started playing, and before Eliza knew what was happening, people were dancing in the yard and the boys were chasing each other around, and the whole place felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the boys were asleep upstairs, Gideon and Eliza sat on the porch together. The stars were out, bright and clear, and the air smelled like grass and earth and possibility. "What are you thinking?" Gideon asked. Eliza considered the question. "I'm thinking about how strange life is. 6 months ago, I was standing on an auction block being sold to pay my father's debts. And now I'm here, married, part of a family, fighting for a ranch that feels more like home than anywhere I've ever lived. You regret any of it?" "Not a single moment." She turned to look at him. "What about you?" "I'm thinking I was drowning and didn't even realize it until you showed up and taught me how to breathe again." "That's surprisingly poetic for a Kansas rancher," Gideon laughed. "Don't get used to it. I'm not good with words." "You do fine." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Gideon said, "What do we do now?" "Now we rebuild. We make this ranch work. We raise those boys to be good men. We live." Sounds simple when you say it like that. It won't be simple. Nothing ever is. But we've survived worse. Have we? Eliza thought about the fire and the court hearing and Boone's threats and all the moments when everything could have fallen apart. Yes, we have. And we'll survive whatever comes next, too. The next few months proved her right. The ranch didn't magically become prosperous. Money was still tight. The drought didn't end just because they'd won in court. And there were still plenty of people in town who looked at Eliza like they couldn't quite figure out what she was doing with Gideon Hale. But things got better, slowly, incrementally, in ways that added up over time. Holloway and Pritchard convinced 2 other ranchers to go in together on a shared water system, using the creek that ran through Hale property as the main source. Gideon agreed on the condition that everyone had equal access and nobody could be priced out. It wasn't a huge profit, but it brought in steady income and created alliances that made the ranch stronger. The cattle herd grew, not dramatically, but enough that they could sell beef at market and actually make a profit. Jacob turned 13 and took on more responsibility. Managing the books with the same sharp attention to detail he applied to everything else. Thomas discovered he had a talent for training horses and started breaking colts for neighboring ranches. Even Samuel, still just 6 years old, found his place helping Eliza in the garden and learning to read by lamplight in the evenings. Mrs. Morrison became a fixture at the ranch, visiting at least twice a week and treating the boys like the grandsons she'd never had. Her daughters both married within the year, one to Holloway's oldest son, the other to a merchant from Riverside, and the connections those marriages created strengthened the community in ways that went beyond business. And Silas Boone? The investigation Judge Calhoun ordered uncovered enough irregularities in his water rights claims that he ended up losing control of several properties. He didn't go to jail, but his influence in the county evaporated almost overnight. People who'd been afraid to cross him suddenly found their courage. Within a year, he'd moved his operations south to Oklahoma Territory, and Harper's Bend breathed easier without him. But the real changes happened inside the house. Gideon learned to talk about his first wife without the conversation ending in silence and pain. He told stories about her at dinner sometimes, funny stories about their early years, mistakes they'd made together, the way she used to sing while she cooked even though she couldn't carry a tune. The boys would laugh, and the memories stopped being weapons that hurt and became bridges that connected. Jacob stopped carrying the weight of the family entirely on his shoulders. He was still serious, still sharp, still older than his years in some ways. But he also learned to be a kid sometimes, to ride his horse fast just for the joy of it, to make stupid jokes with Thomas, to let Eliza teach him things without feeling like he had to already know everything. Thomas's black eye healed, but the confidence it represented didn't fade. He walked taller, spoke louder, stood up for himself and his brothers in ways he hadn't before. He was still getting into scrapes. That was just his nature, but now there was purpose behind it. He wasn't fighting because he was scared. He was fighting because he knew what was worth fighting for. And Samuel stopped expecting everyone to leave. It took time. He still had nightmares sometimes, still woke up crying for his mother or afraid that Eliza had disappeared in the night. But gradually, the fear loosened its grip. He started to believe that people could stay, that home could be permanent, that love didn't always end in loss. For Eliza, the changes were subtler but no less profound. She stopped thinking about the auction block, stopped measuring her worth against $43, stopped waiting for someone to remind her that she'd been bought and therefore could be discarded. She learned what it meant to be chosen instead of sold, to be valued for who she was instead of what she could do, to be part of something not because she was obligated but because she belonged. One evening, almost a year after the court hearing, Eliza was sitting on the porch mending one of Thomas's shirts when Jacob came out and sat down next to her. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Of course." "When you first came here, did you think you'd stay?" Eliza set down her sewing. "Honestly, no. I thought I'd serve out my contract and then leave. Find somewhere else to start over." "What changed?" "You did. Your brothers, your father, this place." She looked out at the ranch, at the fences they'd mended and the fields they'd planted and the life they'd built together. "I realized I didn't want to start over somewhere else. I wanted to make this work. I wanted to stay." Jacob nodded slowly. "I'm glad you did. I don't think we would have made it without you." "You would have. It would have been harder, but you would have found a way. Maybe, but it wouldn't have been the same." He paused. "You know what Ma used to say?" "What?" "She used to say family isn't just the people you're born with. It's the people who choose to stay when things get hard, people who fight for you even when they don't have to." Eliza felt tears prick at her eyes. "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was. And I think she would have liked you." "I would have liked her too." Jacob stood up, stretching. "I'm going to check on the horses. You need anything?" "No, thank you, Jacob." He nodded and walked off toward the barn, his stride confident and easy. Eliza watched him go and thought about how much he'd grown in the past year, how much they'd all grown. That night, lying in bed next to Gideon, Eliza said, "I've been thinking about something." "That's usually dangerous," Gideon said, but there was affection in his voice. "I'm serious." "All right, what have you been thinking about?" "About worth, about how people measure it. When I was on that auction block, my worth was $43. That's what the town decided I was worth. That's what my father accepted." Gideon's arm tightened around her. "You're worth more than any amount of money." "I know that now, but I didn't then. I thought that was it. That was all I'd ever be, someone's property, someone's help, someone's obligation. You were never any of those things." "Yes, I was. At first, I was exactly that. I was the woman you bought because you needed someone to cook and clean and manage your household." "Eliza, let me finish." She turned to face him in the darkness. "I was that woman, but I didn't stay that woman. And the reason I didn't stay that woman is because you and your boys gave me the chance to be something more. You let me fight. You let me have a voice. You treated me like I mattered. You do matter." "I know, but here's what I've learned. Worth isn't something someone else assigns to you. It's not something you can buy or sell or trade. It's something you claim for yourself by how you live and what you fight for and who you choose to stand beside." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When did you get so wise?" "I've always been wise. You just didn't notice." He laughed and kissed her forehead. "I notice now." "Good, because I'm not going anywhere." "I know, and I'm grateful for it every single day." They lay together in the darkness, listening to the house settle around them, the boys breathing in their rooms down the hall, the wind moving through the cottonwood tree outside. And Eliza thought about how strange and unpredictable life could be, how the worst day of your life could lead to the best thing that ever happened to you, how being broken open could make room for something stronger to grow, how family wasn't about blood or obligation or legal contracts. It was about choosing each other, again and again, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. The next morning, Eliza woke early and walked outside to watch the sunrise. The sky turned from black to gray to pink to gold, and the land stretched out around her in all directions, dry and stubborn and beautiful. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see all three boys walking out of the house, still in their nightclothes, rubbing sleep from their eyes. "What are you doing up?" she asked. Couldn't sleep, Thomas said. Heard you moving around, Jacob added. Samuel didn't say anything. He just walked over and slipped his hand into hers. They stood together watching the sun come up, a makeshift family cobbled together from grief and necessity and sheer, stubborn will. They weren't perfect. They still fought sometimes, still struggled, still had days when everything felt like too much. But they were together, and they were home. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Years later, long after the drought had broken and the ranch had become profitable and the boys had grown into men, people would still talk about the woman who was sold at auction and the family she saved. They'd tell the story like it was a legend, polishing it smooth and simple, turning it into something clean and inspirational. But Eliza knew the truth. It wasn't clean, it wasn't simple. It was messy and hard and full of mistakes and moments where they almost didn't make it. It was real. And real was always better than perfect. Because perfect didn't teach you anything. Perfect didn't show you what you were capable of. Perfect didn't force you to dig deep and find strength you didn't know you had. Real did all of that. Real broke you down and built you back up stronger. Real made you earn every good thing that came your way. And if Eliza had learned anything in her years at the Hale Ranch, it was this. You don't get to choose how your story starts. You don't get to pick your circumstances or control what other people do to you or decide whether life is going to be fair. But you do get to choose how you respond. You get to choose whether you fight or surrender. You get to choose who you become in the face of hardship. And Eliza had chosen to fight. She'd chosen to stay when leaving would have been easier. She'd chosen to love a broken family and help them heal. She'd chosen to stand up to a powerful man who thought he could take whatever he wanted. She'd chosen to believe that $43 didn't define her worth, and that being bought didn't mean she couldn't also be chosen. Those choices had made all the difference. Standing on the porch of the ranch that morning, with Samuel's hand in hers, and the sun climbing higher in the sky, and the sound of Gideon and the older boys starting their morning chores, Eliza understood something fundamental about the human experience. We're all broken in some way. We've all been hurt, betrayed, knocked down, made to feel small. We've all stood in places where it seemed like giving up was the only option left. But giving up is never the only option. There's always another choice. Maybe it's a hard choice. Maybe it's a terrifying choice. Maybe it's a choice that requires more courage than you think you have. But it's there, and sometimes making that choice changes everything. Not overnight, not magically, but slowly, steadily, in ways that compound over time until you look around one day and realize you're standing somewhere you never thought you'd reach. That's what Eliza had learned. That's what the Hales had taught her. That's what they'd all taught each other. Life doesn't owe you fairness. It doesn't owe you ease or comfort or happy endings. But it does give you choices. And those choices, the hard ones, the brave ones, the ones that require you to believe in something when belief feels impossible, those are the ones that matter. Those are the ones that save you. Come on, Samuel said, tugging on her hand. Pa's making breakfast. Eliza smiled and let the boy lead her inside, back to the warm kitchen and the noisy family and the ordinary, beautiful chaos of a life she'd fought to build. It wasn't the life she'd expected. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was hers. Truly, completely hers. And that made it worth every moment of the fight it had taken to claim it.